Seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
Everybody's out to get you. Don't you let it drag you down. 'Cause if you ever feel neglected, if you think that all is lost, I'll be counting up my demons, yeah. Hoping everything's not lost. If you ever feel neglected, if you think that all is lost, I'll be counting up my demons, yeah. Hoping everything's not lost. Singing out, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. Everything's not lost, so come on, yeah. Oh yeah, oh come on, yeah. Everything's not lost. Oh yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the 7th Annual FAV Summit General Session. Please welcome to the stage the moderator for this session, Dr. John Robbins from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University.
All right, good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here in Miami moderating this very important panel on vertical takeoff or landing, eVTOL systems, and urban air mobility. It's such a growing area, and there's so much interest in it moving forward. I'm the program coordinator of an unmanned aircraft systems program at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, and we've seen exponential growth since we started in 2011. We're up to about 250 students, so there's a lot of interest from the academic side, but then of course, we see all the applications moving forward. So today, we're going to run a panel with Mr. Peter Berger from Embry-Air-X and Dr. Tassilo Vonner from Lilium. So if I would like to welcome you both to the stage. Great. All right, and the way that we're going to run this this morning is we are going to have some short presentations followed by a Q&A session, and then we really want to go out to the audience and get questions from you because I think that we'll have quite a lot of them. So, Mr. Berger is the Director of Innovation at Embry-Air-X in Silicon Valley, which is a disruptive innovation division for Embry-Air, the third largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. Mr. Berger has 3 roles within Embry-Air-X. First, to oversee active projects, most notably the all-electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle eVTOL being built in collaboration with Uber. Second, to oversee Embry-Air's investment activity in North America. Third, to work with Embry-Air's existing business units to foster innovation within their existing product lines and processes. Prior to joining Embry-Air-X, Mr. Berger was the CEO of several startups, including Contact IQ, Allotora Systems, and Topic Marks, which sold to the Meet Group in 2011. Additionally, he has advised numerous startups and Fortune 500 companies such as Orange Telecom and Qualcomm. Mr. Berger has an undergraduate degree from California Polytechnic and a law degree from Rutgers University. We'd like to have him present first, and then I will introduce Dr. Vonner.
Thank you. So I appreciate the applause and make sure that everybody's paying attention. Good morning, my name is Peter Berger. I am the Director of Innovation at Embraer in our newly founded X division. I came from, as you heard, from the software background and have had the incredible privilege of working with some of the most intelligent people I've ever had the experience to work with. So to give you a little bit more background about Embraer, we are a Brazilian aircraft manufacturer. So we are as old as Airbus. We have been making planes for over 50 years, both commercial aircraft, executive aircraft, as well as military and security products. Over our 50-year history, we've built more than 8,000 aircraft. We have also, if you've experienced our aircraft in regional flight in the 2x2 configuration, we sell to almost every single major aircraft manufacturer in the world. 8,000 aircraft. To this date, one of our planes takes off every 10 seconds, and we fly roughly 180 million people every year safely. So one of the things about working for Embraer, which is an incredible privilege, is not just simply working through the heritage, but also the culture of innovation. And that has facilitated our rapid advance into urban air technology and dealing with this broader challenge of not just simply making a vehicle, but solving the problem of how do you fly within a city. And the way we address that problem is by looking at it through an ecosystem. And not just simply saying we're building one particular product, but looking at the series of products that will be able to facilitate the reality of urban air mobility. We start off with air traffic management. If you go to flightplan2030.com, you can download an incredibly readable 120-page paper about urban air mobility and air traffic management. I think that probably part of the discussion later will turn on the fact that aviation has some unique advantages over on-the-road autonomy, in particular that we have a long history of coordination. We also have a long history of secured systems, regulated systems, and ultimately of centralized vehicle management, which is currently unavailable for cars. We're working with our partners, Harris Aviation, which is one of the largest suppliers of infrastructure in the United States, as well as our subdivision of Embraer ATEC, to address the larger issues of how do you keep these vehicles flying, particularly in a future where you could have hundreds of these vehicles in every city around the world. We developed a software suite called Beacon, where we work not just simply on Embraer's products, but products across aviation, managing services overall through mechanics, tools, and parts. And then lastly, probably one of the main reasons why you all decided to step away from the coffee, we're working on an all-electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle. So without further ado, this is our vehicle, and this is our video. You would be hearing a very inspiring overture. There we go. Thank you. Thank you for the applause. Just for clarification, I did none of that myself. So I will tell the team back at Embraer that you gave applause and they were very appreciative. We're working very hard to develop the aircraft. In particular, one of the largest challenges is not just simply the engineering challenge, but the challenge of working with customers that we had previously very little contact with as a larger company. Our customers used to be, and still are, United Airlines, Lufthansa, JAL, a lot of the airlines that you flew here on today. But those operators don't exist in this new ecosystem. So we had to go directly to the riders. We had to go literally entirely around the globe and talking to people, not just simply about what they want for a service, but what they feel comfortable getting in and riding. So a perfect example is we made the booms very high so people feel comfortable getting in and out. There was this subconscious thing that people were worried about, that they would be injured by the rotors in some way, shape, or form, even though this is well over 2 meters off the ground. And most people are, not quite that tall, but creating a safe environment so that you can feel that you can ingress and egress easily. We are focusing on all-electric technology, not only for the environmental benefits, but also for the fact that for cost of operation, it radically reduces the expense and the complexity. I can go into this individually if you talk to me afterwards, but I think that urban air mobility is a unique situation where the benefits to our customers actually relate very strongly to a lot of good economic drivers for us. There's not very many conflicts at all between safe, affordable operation and the design principles that we're focusing on. So in fact, everything that we do not only benefits us as a business, but deeply benefits our customers. And we're very fortunate to be in that position. So as I said, we're not just simply focusing on the aircraft, but we're focusing on the ecosystem and be able to manage air traffic management, services and support, as well as vehicle to be able to bring urban air mobility, not just simply to 1 or 2 limited cities, but make it an industry that you can all take advantage of in the future. And one of the big questions you ask, well, how do I participate in this today? Even though there's going to be a fairly long road to development, you can go online right now because we don't have a good name for our vehicle yet. And we would love to have you participate. So if you'd like to go to embraerx.com, you can submit your name, and if it gets chosen, then you will have named this class of vehicle. And so that is the way you can get started in participating in it today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Peter. We've come a long way since the first powered and controllable airplane was flown by the Wright brothers. So very interesting stuff. All right, next I'd like to welcome Dr. Tassilo Vanner. He's the VP of Global Public and Regulatory Affairs at Lilium. He oversees the company's worldwide stakeholder engagement, advocacy efforts, and regulatory and government affairs strategy. Previously, Tassilo was an engagement manager at McKinsey & Company, leading TTL, which is transport, travel, and logistics, as well as strategy and change management studies. Before joining McKinsey, he spent 4 years in political planning and strategic communication roles for the parliamentary leadership in the German Bundestag, as well as for the German Federal Minister of the Interior, Berlin. Tassilo has studied at LMU Munich and Georgetown University and earned a doctorate in political science and modern history. Please welcome Dr. Vanner.
Thanks a lot, Joe, for hosting us, and thanks a lot, Peter. I think that was a fantastic segue into a quick presentation on what Lilium is up to. Actually, the good news is that also we as a new emerging sub-industry are very well aligned. Actually, Peter's and my team at this very hour sitting together up in Daytona Beach, right, to align across industry on standards and also with FAA already on the flight standards and operational frameworks for this to happen as soon as possible in very solid kind of rule of law environments as well. There's one slight difference in terms of approaches when it comes to other projects in Lilium, and just so that there are no misunderstandings out there, Automated Vehicle Summit and Peter speaking a lot on autonomy. Lilium is of the view that given the progress of our certification, and the aircraft is in certification already, actually neither the legal frameworks will be in place nor the public acceptance actually for remotely piloted or autonomous operations. So what Lilium is really up to is launching in a rather traditional way when it comes to the regulatory framework with a pilot physically on board the aircraft. It's the entry into service scenario. Of course, there is a mid and long-term scenario as well, and remotely piloted will be part of that with a pilot controlling maybe at the beginning one and then multiple aircraft from an ops control center somewhere. Really autonomous flight, I think, is very far out, but of course it's part of the vision. the technical platform on which we will be capable of doing that with the pilot on board you see here. And it's a fixed wing aircraft, and I'll show you the very aircraft really flying in a minute. And it being fixed wing has just a lot of advantages. Again, from a regulatory perspective, this is certifiable in existing regulatory frameworks with FAA. And at the same time, from an efficiency point of view, allows us to put a pilot on board. So it will be a pilot and 4 passengers that we can transport on a single battery charge that's also fully electric over 180, 50 miles, about the same speed. So it's a battery charge that brings you an hour away from where you are. That is the basis on which we will also make it possible already at entry into service, already with the pilot on board at a very low price point. And I'm very well aware of many eVTOL projects telling that kind of story, but here's a very solid business case behind it in terms of hundreds of passenger miles per hour provided on a single aircraft. Because if you think of going from here to Fort Lauderdale, that's a connection that we can easily serve 2 times, maybe even 2.5 or 3 times per hour, means 8, 10, 12 passengers on a single vehicle, whereas a taxi on average transports 0.3 or 0.4 passengers per hour. So you see this is 20, maybe 30 times more powerful in terms of passenger miles. Of course, our pilot is more expensive than a cab driver, and the vehicle is not as inexpensive as a car, but not by a factor of 20 or 30. And this puts us in position to make that possible at a very democratic price point, which I think is extremely important also for public acceptance from day one. Lilium was being founded some 5 years ago, and very humble demonstrators marking the beginning of the project, obviously. In 2017, something I think remarkable happened in terms of a team of 8 engineers at that time having developed and tested the first electric transition aircraft in aviation history, actually. There was a humble 2-seater demonstrator at that point in time, but it allowed us ever since to grow to what is now the largest eVTOL developing entity in the world with more than 350 people and an incredible level of experience and engineering capability coming together. This is people like Mirko Reuter, who was actually heading Audi's autonomous vehicle program, now engaged in our flight control / autonomy department. This is people like Yves Yemzi, who was SVP quality for the A350 program with Airbus, maybe quality-wise not the worst aircraft in the world actually, who's now overseeing our supply chain. But in 2019, which was May of this year actually, we were then capable of showing this to the world, and this is not the first eVTOL transitioning successfully, but it's the first eVTOL in operational scale and meeting all the requirements. So this is 300 kilometers of a radius in terms of the range, or 185 miles. This is 185 miles per hour top speed. And most importantly, maybe, it's aviation safety grade. So this is to be certified as a 10 to the minus 9 aircraft, roughly 1,000 times more safe than a helicopter. And what we are extremely proud of, 6 to 7 times more silent than a helicopter when taken off. And when we have transitioned to cruise flight, what you see here, with the engines, ducted fan engines, seamlessly tilted back to the rear, pointed to the ground when taking off, pointed to the ground when landing, but then fully taking advantage of very traditional wing-borne flight physics, we don't leave any acoustic signature on the ground anymore. Here we actually take advantage of the fact that the flight control software has already been tested on the demonstrators that I had presented before. So for years and years we have been refining the software, and at the same time it's a very lean, simple, you could say, propulsion system. So it's not different propulsion systems for lift and cruise, but it's actually one which is much easier to control actually, and this is why it only took us weeks from the first vertical hop that we announced in May to flights such as this one. In terms of the application, as this is extremely efficient, being fixed wing, It has a range that is roughly 10 times further than copter in the eVTOL field. So in terms of connectivity, just to inspire you, this is where you could get from Miami, again, within an hour or less, and on a single battery charge. Includes all the keys, brings you up to just short of Tampa. But the good news, actually, this is on basis of today's battery technology. This is on basis of batteries that are physically with us, that are in testing. And as you're all very well aware of from the different industries you're coming from, it's growing, and therefore also the range will be growing. Has also tremendous implications from a public perspective, obviously, because if you think of more traditional kind of high speed, this is in the decades of planning, this is politically very contentious, this is extremely intense in terms of surface consumption, right? I mean, we just discussed, right? I mean, streets have been cut through the Everglades at a time when this was still possible from a political point of view. I don't know if additional such infrastructure could be added. We just glide over and provide a very nice 360 degrees view of the Everglades. So this is very lean in terms of less than 18 months of an approval process and building time. And in terms of invest, if you compare, for example, to the famous Singapore-Kuala Lumpur example, where the high-speed railroad was just being cancelled as a project, it was projected to be $22 billion in investment. We could provide the same throughput, but bring people really from neighborhood to the neighborhood where they want to go, rather than funneling through the city center at an invest that is less than 2% of the respective counter proposal. Very quickly, to wrap it up, in terms of the regulatory strategy, because you might now think, wow, that's cool technically, and it's a good application for here and there, but is it really possible, right? And the good news is that, again, I'd refer to that, we are in certification for an existing aircraft category. We're putting a fully fledged CPL pilot on board, and there is a business case for doing that, given the payload and the utilization of the aircraft. In terms of operations, she or he can communicate very traditionally over voice with air traffic control. And we've also confirmed with FAA and other important regulators that's actually the same process for a helipad that allows us to establish new eVTOL infrastructure. So it's very lean an infrastructure, and even leaner than you know it, because traditionally from helicopters that has to account for auto-rotation scenarios, it has to account for burning liquids being on board. The helicopter is less safe, I was referring to that at the beginning, than our vehicle, and it's much more noisy, so you can also do it in places where traditionally it would have been prohibitive to operate with helicopters. With that, I hope we'll have a good discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Varner. All right, so I would like to ask a couple of questions. First off, you know, we have this autonomy. Autonomy is a major component of the requirements to fly these things. However, is it necessary? Is it necessary in the beginning stages of urban air mobility?
So speaking for Embraer and just sort of larger market challenges, I actually agree with Dr. Werner that initial operations will be piloted. Regulators will demand it. It is also necessary, as many people in this audience know, because as you are onboarding your autonomous systems, the autonomous systems at the very least still need supervision. So for a reasonable period of time, there will be 4-passenger, 1-pilot operations. At a later point in time, the cabins may be shrunk for purposes of economy or more seats added because the cockpit does take up a good bit of room. But for scaled operation, we believe that autonomy is necessary. And what Embraer is working towards internally is to develop an autonomous system that will be autonomous ready the first day we're in commercial operations. Even though that autonomy may not be active, it'll still be essentially sitting by the pilot watching and learning. Because as everybody knows in autonomous vehicle land, that your systems need a lot of repetition. They need a lot of reps. They need to get a lot of practice, as all good drivers and pilots do.
And I totally agree, right? So that there is no misunderstanding in the room. Actually, it will be at least remotely piloted. So I would be curious if it is really autonomy that you're talking about, or remotely piloted operations, but it will be without a pilot on board one day, and hopefully only a few years after entering into service. But for entering service, I think there is no other scenario than having a pilot on board.
We're not incredibly bullish on remote piloting, particularly having to do with lag and communications connectivity. We think that might introduce significantly more challenges. But I think that we're all going to be working closely with regulators to understand how do you transition from a fully piloted vehicle to an autonomous vehicle, and what are the steps in between that ensure safe operation. I think that one of the things that as an industry, both for aviation and autonomous vehicles, we constantly need to reinforce is these systems are not for convenience. These are safety systems. They're not going to be introduced unless they result in significantly more safety for the passengers and the public. And in aviation, I know that we're incredibly focused on safety constantly. Transportation is a dangerous profession, and ultimately we need to take these things incredibly seriously. So, whether it is piloted directly to autonomous, whether there's a remote pilot, whether there's remote supervision, we're going to be following and working following regulations and working closely with regulators to ensure safe operation.
And the good news actually is, and I agree here as well, up in the air it's even easier than on the street, right? To transition into such new era, because ACES, what the automotive industry is aiming for, is actually already a reality up there, right? In terms of automated or capable of autonomy, connected, everything is up there. Electric and sharing, both of us are, right?
Yes.
So that it's much easier to transition into that because it's already up there and there is no scenario of mixed traffic, which is really the big hurdle on the street.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of movement. We see the FAA's process. We're working towards the research initiatives with remotely piloted vehicles, moving forward into some of the landmarks that we've been able to achieve in the industry over time, looking at airworthiness certification standards, pilot training, infrastructure development, airspace integration, all of those things. So, with those components being a reality of operations in the future, is it realistic that we'll see those aircraft operating by 2025? And what are the next steps to get there?
Yes, absolutely it is, right? I mean, the question is for how many of the projects, but I know the status of our certification program and where and how we are doing it and progressing. I think there is a lot of positive attention on the eVTOL sector from the regulator. I mean, I used to be civil servant, and had a positive perception of what civil servants are doing, but still was very surprised actually by the high appetite, the high level of appetite, the tremendous openness from people such as FAA, EASA for us in Europe as well, and also the resource. I mean, it's always scarce resources, right? But they're allocating to not only the certification, but also the flight standards dimension, which is really the operational rules. So what is the aircrew requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So they're really trying to kind of thought lead that, both I think FAA and EASA, almost in a bit of a competition situation in terms of who makes it possible first. But again, the good news here is that it's very traditional certification processes and programs that we and the other projects, if they are in certification already, are going through. So there will be no compromise on the safety level.
Yeah, and I would just concur with that. I think that there's, 2025 is quite achievable. In addition to that, I think the only matter is a matter of scale. Is how much of it you will be seeing. Will certain vehicles and operations be entering into service slightly before that? Exactly. It's possible. And it has a lot to do with regulators, technology development, the type of service, whether it's remote or urban. I think it's going to be an interesting path. And in fact, I was at a NASA event a few weeks back where we were all sort of chatting in the room. So autonomous vehicles, some NASA people, some urban air mobility people. And if you look at what the world will look like in 2025, NASA will have pretty consistent human habitation and occupancy of the moon. Hopefully you folks will be able to help us with the autonomous driving part. And we're going to be working hard on essentially, urban air mobility, flight. So what is our world going to look like where all these promises that our parents had in the 1960s of, the flying taxi, the autonomous car, and the habitation on the moon? Well, congratulations, folks, we're getting there. So it's really exciting.
Absolutely. All right, I'd like to open it up for a couple of questions from the audience. We have a few minutes left, and does anybody have any questions? Great.
I'd just like to have a clarification. Sometimes acronyms float around that people don't understand. What is a CPL licensed pilot?
It's commercial pilot license.
A commercial pilot license. as opposed to a private pilot's license. It's
Yeah.
a higher level of aeronautical experience, IFR capabilities being instrument flight rules, etc., etc.
As a senior-aged admirer of all the young talent that's in this room, I'm Lisa Miller from Tallahassee. What did we do to get those in my generation to embrace a lot of this technology? In the back of the room, we were talking about the previous panel, Walmart delivering things quickly and folks not going out anymore and staying at home. You know, those of us in my generation are always very social and do those types of things. Do we envision having, I don't want to say special accommodations, but marketing to people in my generation that will gravitate and embrace this technology? I know a lot of it is geared to the younger generation, but I think it's a great marketing approach for you to know that many in our generation have the discretionary income to embrace what you're doing.
So thank you. It's like as if I prompted you to do that. Thank you. So as I was saying during my brief talk, that we're in a unique situation where as product developers, we actually have almost symbiotic relationships with our potential riders. A perfect example is we're trying to build aircraft that are accessible to everyone, because it allows for different, essentially additional mobility. So as you get older and you have potentially less ability to drive at night, that's my mother's problem, that maybe you don't have the hand-eye skill that you used to, so autonomous driving is a tremendous help for you. It enables you to be far more independent and active much later in your life. For an urban air mobility, it also allows you to have a much more tightly interconnected city. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that all families have is that as economic opportunities change, you get further and further away. That a lot of us 2-3 generations ago, we all stayed in the same towns. And so that level of mobility disintegrates families and makes it tougher to build cohesive units. As people age, the fact of the matter is you can't travel 4 hours a day, because that's a lot of wear and tear on you mentally and physically. But being able to reduce travel times radically by up to 40% or greater produces greater mobility for that person. And in regards to raw design, we're designing these vehicles for everyone. I know for our purposes, we've looked at all the differently abled, whether it's wheelchair access, elderly access. Building a product for an athletic 20-year-old limits your market. It's strategically a bad idea. However, if you make a product accessible to everyone, it broadens your market. Again, it's the symbiosis. If you make it accessible, more people can use it, and that gives us a bigger market. So it makes a better product, and it makes it more accessible for other people. So we're very lucky in that regard.
And the beauty is that the pricing will even go down dramatically, right? So the taxi pricing that I was referring to at the beginning, this is for initial operations, right? Whereas a few years after that, like very strong effects will kick in that allow us to go down further with the pricing being the pilot taken out of the aircraft, one of the largest cost buckets, obviously. At the same time, unit cost will go down, right? Because we will scale up production, and network effects really will kick in, right? In the Florida example, this will be maybe initially only the large cities where you have 1 or 2 nodes per city, basically. Whereas in a future scenario, there will be dozens and potentially 3 digits number of pads, at least in the state of Florida, right? And then with every pad that you're adding to the network, you're adding n-1 connections. And the interesting thing, though, last point to that is, if you think of where you want to have your retirement home, for example, right? Yeah. This is even more relevant, or relatively more relevant for remote locations, right? Because the remotest location in this county can be connected to, I don't know, the international airport here at the same speed or time, right, that would consume you to go there, as if you had a Hyperloop connection out of Miami downtown, right? But there you invest billions to serve only one AB, origin destination, whereas this is really a network.
Right. And the easiest way of saying is the remote is no longer remote.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right, we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Eric Myers. I'm with the Smart Electric Power Alliance, and I had a question about how you're planning to charge your equipment. And I work with electric utilities across the country, and how can they help you be successful?
Sure. Actually, we're working very closely with electric infrastructure all the way down the pipeline. There's a lot of challenges, but I think there's also a lot of tremendous opportunities. So first of all, there's the last meter problem of just connections, which is being addressed by, at least for the people in the Uber Elevate network, by ChargePoint. There's a large number of utilities that are very interested in whether or not they need to modify their grids, and sort of the intermediate, medium-term components, which might facilitate significant amounts of battery backup, other types of peaker centers. But we want to do this in a very environmentally, not even environmentally sensitive, but environmentally sensible way. That, let's not introduce an electric technology that actually ends up being more polluting because you're putting more burden on the grid, which essentially relies on dirty power. So we're moving in that way very linearly. The other thing that I think is sort of an unknown fact, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, that for purposes of electric aviation, our battery usage is going to result in a lot of very, very high quality batteries being on the secondary market. So it presents a tremendous opportunity, because having a brand new lithium-ion battery as a power wall is not particularly a good use case. You don't need it to be that good, but having a very good battery power pack that can be used as a collective charging unit, secondary markets, we're going to be, because of safety and regulation, we're going to be using batteries far more quickly than electric vehicles are right now. Far more quickly, because we don't need to engineer for 10 years of life. We're engineering for a much shorter time span, but these batteries will still have significant amounts of life in them for particular use cases as battery backup, power walls, buffers, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sharon, we actually internally just set up a project that now bundles all the inbound requests of people who are interested in buying then used batteries. They will be 10 to the -9, obviously. They will be extremely efficient, extremely strong. Right?
Even after we've used them for an extended period of time, there'll just be a certain amount of degradation, but it's the degradation that for purposes of safety, we want to get out of the system, but for purposes of use as battery backup, no problem. And if anybody's curious, I'm sure both of us would like to talk to you, and I'm sure that we'll talk about sort of finding out ways of having a central standard so there's very little transition friction between using these things on vehicles and using them in the infrastructure.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, so that brings us to the end of our time. Dr. Vonner and Mr. Berger will be available during the conference if you'd like to come over and ask them questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our awards will start in 2 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, here again is your host, MDX Executive Director, Javier Rodriguez.
Good morning again. If I can ask Senator Brandis and Secretary Thibault to join me on stage a second. I have the distinct honor and privilege of presenting this year's Leadership and Innovation Award. It's given to individuals who are diligently working to position Florida and its beautiful cities, like my hometown, Miami-Dade County, as leaders in ACES technology. Automated, connected, electric, and shared technology is advancing quickly, and Florida, with its progressive testing laws and leaders like the ones we have on stage and our nominees, are at the forefront of attracting business to help bring these technologies to the public. Mayor Carlos Jimenez and Director Alice Bravo are two leaders who understand not only the economic impacts that these emerging technologies can play, but they also realize the impact that ACES technology has on the public. I share a little story. You heard this morning our chairman, Mayor Oliver Gilbert, speak about imagine, not just innovate, imagine. Well, I'm fortunate to live in a community where we have a chief Imagineer. And I take that word from Walt Disney. I don't know if you worked in Walt Disney at one time, but it doesn't really matter. Mayor Carlos Jimenez challenges us, anybody who lives here in Miami, to look beyond and to figure out how we can provide the community the best at the best service in a reliable and sustainable manner. And he's challenged Alice and her group to think above and beyond. You name it here in Miami, whether it is smart signals, whether it is shared mobility, whether it is transit technologies, whether it is Hyperloop, whether it is flying cars, we've looked at it here. We are actively looking at it here, and we're creating an environment that will allow these companies to go. So I'd like to introduce to you our recipients of the 2019 Leadership and Innovation Award, Mayor Carlos Jimenez and Director Alice Bravo.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to receive this award, and on behalf of the 2.8 million residents that call Miami-Dade home. And I'm also very honored to be here in the presence of Senator Brandis and Secretary Thibault. If it weren't for people like Senator Brandis, who's actually been the sponsor of many of the legislation that actually allows us to innovate and experiment and be at the forefront, I wouldn't be here today. And so when I walked in, I saw, Tassilo here from Lilium, and we've been talking to Lilium for about a couple of years about making Miami-Dade the first place in the United States that they will actually introduce their vehicles. And so I'm making a pitch again. Hey, I want it to be here, Miami-Dade, that with the flying vehicles are going to take off, because, again, that's looking to the future, making mobility much easier, improving the quality of life of every single resident of Miami-Dade County, improving the quality of life of every single resident of the state of Florida, and making Florida and Miami-Dade the pinnacle of innovation, the city of the future, the state of the future. That's what our vision is. And some people call me spaceman here, okay, because I'm always looking up, and I call other people cavemen because they're always looking back. I don't look back, I look ahead. And in order to improve our quality of life, in order to be the beacon of innovation, in order to attract new businesses and new industries to our state and to Miami-Dade County, we need to have very forward-thinking legislation that allows us to do that, but we also need to have leadership that is willing to take a chance and is willing to, every once in a while, make a mistake in order to move us forward. And so I'm very honored to receive this award. I will continue. I still have one more year left on as mayor of Miami-Dade County, then I'm termed out. But I will continue to to always be in public service here in our community, and I will continue to push for innovation, and I'll continue to push to make sure and assure that Miami-Dade County is that city of the future. You're seeing this city being built around us. How many of you are from Miami? Okay. Well, the ones that aren't from Miami, if you weren't here, if you haven't been here in about 5 years, you probably say, hey, a lot has changed in Miami. A lot more is going to change in the next 5 years. And our transportation options are going to change not only in Miami and the state of Florida, but in the United States and around the world. We're really on the cusp of some incredible, amazing things. And I'm glad, and I hope to be around to see all of it as it comes to fruition, as we improve our quality of life for our children and our grandchildren, which is really what we're here to do. Improve the quality of life of our children and our grandchildren, which is our duty as a generation need to leave to the next generation. So thank you very much. I'm very honored. May God bless you all.
Well, it's certainly tough to follow the mayor, but I first and foremost want to thank him for giving me the opportunity 4.5 years ago to bring two departments together at the county, transit and public works, and basically focus the county's resources on our transportation issues. Our community was demanding that we do things to improve transportation here, and that's when the evolution into our role as mobility managers began. So I want to thank him always for supporting us and for pushing us forward, driving us forward to be on the bleeding edge and exploring every possible technology that we can bring here to our residents, to our visitors, and help prepare Miami-Dade County for the future. And I really want to thank Senator Brandis. He's been instrumental in so many things that we've accomplished here, first and foremost with the legislation that you established for the state, but also opening a lot of doors for us and creating contacts that have led to the partnerships that we have, especially with Ford. So I think it's important for us to be this area where these new technologies can be demonstrated and evolved, and we'll be the beneficiaries of that because this will probably be one of the first places where the technology is implemented. So that's a benefit to everyone. At the end of the day, it's all about helping people improve their lives, and time is one of our most valuable resources. So if we can find ways through efficiency, through technology, to give people some of their time back, time equals opportunity. That's how you access employment, education, healthcare, all the things that help improve the quality of life for people here. So I'm just thrilled to be part of this transportation system at this exciting time and really help propel Dade County into the future. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, for our next session, please welcome to the stage Riley Brennan, founding general partner, Trucks.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Riley Brennan. I work for an investment fund called Trucks Venture Capital, and we are an investment fund only focused on transportation deals. And so I like to think that I would have been smart enough to invest in any of the three companies on here on stage, but in fact, I wasn't. Nevertheless, they allowed me to moderate this session. As to my other bona fides, I would say with the state of Florida, like any nice Midwestern boy, I had a grandmother that lived in Boca Raton at Sable Shores, Unit 402. And I always thought of Florida as a place where my grandmother lived until really a few years ago. And I would have to thank Senator Brandis and Representative Fisher for helping me to kind of evolve my thinking. And now I would say fundamentally, Florida is one of the most consequential places for transportation technology, both because of the companies that are here, but also the regulatory framework, some of the urban planning that's going on, and the overall, really, this conference, it's really quite impressive. So I think of Florida as being very important, and therefore, this is one of the few conferences that I make sure I come to every single year. So thanks for having me, and I wanted to welcome our three excellent panelists here. I'll just march down the row here and we'll do a brief introduction. The first is Scott Ferris, who's the Chief Business Officer for Luminar Technologies, which is a company that's headquartered here in Florida. Yep. Next is Oliver Cameron, who's the CEO of Voyage, which is headquartered in Silicon Valley, but is doing most of its deployments here at the Villages in Florida. And also we have Jody Kelman, who's the Director of Self-Driving Platform at Lyft. And so please welcome my three panelists here. The first question I have is really around the idea of self-driving cars either taking too long or not moving fast enough, or this overall feeling I've received maybe over the last 12 months that, wow, this is really going to take longer than we thought. And, as somebody who's deeply involved in funding these companies, I've never actually met a roboticist or a founder who had aggressive timelines for doing their work. And I know that a lot of executives get on stage and say things like that. And I wanted to ask, maybe first with Oliver, how do you feel about the fact that there's a sentiment that AVs actually take a long time to develop?
Yes, I think it's indisputable that AVs have taken longer than people originally believed, whether it was a decade ago, even 2 years ago. That said, we'll look back in 10, 15, 20 years and think, well, what was the difference between, a few years? Because the effects will be transformative. The other thing that's really worth noting is that for the last 5 years, everyone's been very, very focused on the autonomous software piece. How can you make a car drive itself? But then, as we know in the airline industry, there's all these different things that need to happen before you can take that kind of prototype software and take that then to the broader market to commercialize that technology for real. And I'm excited to see that there's companies like Luminar, like many others, that are really ramping up for commercial scale, where their software, their hardware is going to be automotive grade and really ready. But it's hard to dispute it has taken longer. It will be worth it, that's for sure.
It's interesting because, all three of you, these companies on stage, are actually doing AV things today. So there are a lot of companies that fundamentally are still 5-6 years out from having real products. These companies are either selling or deploying things this very day. Wanted to ask Jody, who particularly is an interesting perspective, I think, because Lyft has their own engineering group, but is also an integrator of others that are doing AV systems. And fundamentally, because of that dependency, I think would have a unique perspective on timelines. So Jody, how do you feel about whether the sentiment of AV timelines is either fast or slow?
Yeah, I think for us, we are living this every single day. So if you go to Las Vegas or Phoenix right now and open up your Lyft app, you can actually request a self-driving ride today powered by our partners Aptiv and Waymo. And so for us, this isn't sort of a theoretical future that is coming somewhere. Every time we get a Lyft passenger into one of these rides, we know we are shaping the way we are going to deploy self-driving technology at scale. And so there's this really interesting lens for us, which is, you know, what we hear in the press is exactly the same thing everyone else does, which is people are scared of self-driving technology, they're not ready, consumer adoption is going to be a huge barrier to deployment. But what we see in our data is just, it doesn't reflect that sort of sense of nervousness. So we've done over 75,000 rides to date. We've received a 4.97 ride rating out of 5 stars. So people really like engaging with this technology. But the most powerful thing for me is that 96% of our passengers tell us they want to come back for their second ride. And so what that says to me is consumers are ready. We just need to be able to bring this technology to market as quickly and as safely as possible.
Got it. And Scott, Luminar sells a component, so explain to us what exactly LiDAR is. I've heard that term a lot, but I'm not really sure what I know what it means.
Sure. So LiDAR, you know, in a really simple sense, is we're doing the work of radar. Most people are probably familiar with radar, but we're using light to do it. So we use a laser. We distribute the laser light, bounce it off of objects, and then reconstruct an image from that. Why that's important is that the image you get back not only tells you what something is, but it gives you a lot of contextual knowledge about how far away it is. And if we think about safety and self-driving, time is really the most essential element. The more time you have to understand the environment, the more time you have to plan and move for the safety of the passengers, but also the safety of pedestrians and those around you. You can execute again a safe self-driving move, and really that's really what LiDAR allows you to do. Is it provides time for my compatriots next to me to be able to move passengers around in a safe and respectable way.
Great. And so talk about the Florida ecosystem, and you know the company is probably one of the most important reasons why we're going to have more self-driving vehicle technology startups here. In addition to some of the regulators and Senator Brandis, it's really, Luminar is one of the companies I think about most when I think about Florida AV tech.
Sure, yeah, you know, we a little bit of luck. You know, so LiDAR actually was invented in Orlando. I've been quoted, LiDAR, Orlando is the Silicon Valley of LiDAR. There's been roughly 30 LiDAR companies over the years evolved. It's been predominantly used for military over the years. And so Luminar has benefited from having an extremely rich environment of talent. I think in our engineering team, we've got over 1,000 years of man and women experience of building and manufacturing LiDAR systems. And so for Florida, you know, for us, it's been a great environment. Again, we do some of our own testing. You know, some of our partners are starting to do some testing here. We've certainly been trying to be proactive as a company to help the state grow, attract some of our partners, attract some of our competitors. We're very much committed to really building a strong ecosystem, not only on the deployment side, but also on the underlying technology.
Great. And one of the qualities of Florida, which we were just chatting about, is there's a lot of interesting planning that goes on, which in many ways was intended really for people of a certain stage of life, but in fact make the rollout of certain transportation services particularly appropriate. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what's going on in Orlando, and then after that we'll talk about the villages with Oliver.
Sure. So, you know, I think that, you know, overall in Florida, one of the biggest challenges is growth. And it's a state that people like to come to, really at all stages of life. It's just not people who are retired. But, you know, in Orlando in particular, I think we have 1,500 new residents each week move to the Orlando area. As you can imagine, that creates a tremendous amount of stress on the infrastructure. And I think that, you know, we're at a point in time now where people are starting to realize that the answer is not necessarily about building more infrastructure, but how do we use our existing infrastructure more intelligently. And again, automated platforms really create some exciting opportunities to think about how we're using the existing infrastructure and how we can design future infrastructure to be more flexible and to accommodate that. So again, we're seeing some really interesting developments in Central Florida. People are starting from master plan communities are starting to think about how they integrate autonomy as a service into the community. We're starting to see developments, for example, where those developments are enabled by autonomous delivery infrastructure. To me, it's really exciting that we're starting to see the adoption, not necessarily in main city streets and complex areas, but in specifically kind of user-designed activities where the technology can be deployed and future-proofed. So communities that understand that the technology is going to evolve, but infrastructure and decisions are being made today to accommodate the evolution of automated technologies.
And do you feel that if you do have more of these, whether they are master planned or cities start having more control over the various transportation services within them, which is certainly the case in California, that a company like yourself would actually want to be putting sensors within the infrastructure? Like, could you ever see Luminar on a gantry or a bollard or something like that?
Absolutely. So, this is about not only smart vehicles, but complementary smart infrastructure. Vehicles can't see everything. We try, but we can't see through things. So we haven't invented a technology that allows you to see through a large truck. So having data streams from other vantage points, whether it be fixed stationary applications on buildings looking at high-risk intersections, all that information comes together in a very virtuous way to help the vehicles operate in a safer and more responsible way. And quite frankly, I think actually accelerates the adoption of autonomous technologies because you can fill in some of the holes using some smart infrastructure. But absolutely, we see interest in, LiDAR basically extends the range of cameras. LiDAR can see in conditions that cameras can't, so we're seeing interest in smart rail, smart traffic monitoring, all kinds of applications.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. So talk about, I know that part of the thread of the origin story of Voyage is really thinking about these markets, this market in particular with villages. And so would love to hear from you why Florida is so special to the company and villages specifically.
For sure. So the way we've always thought of Voyage is that the initial rollouts of self-driving technology will be like all other transformative technologies in that they have a pretty rough beginning, right? They won't be as smooth as we would like. They won't be as reliable as we would like. They will be as safe as we'd like, but they won't be many other things that all consumers may want. And if we think about that challenge, then our belief is that city centers or just transportation hubs which already have an abundance of option perhaps are not the best first place for this imperfect technology. So we very much believe that senior citizens are the best first customer of self-driving cars because they, in many cases, don't have that alternative. For example, our defined customer today is someone who can walk but cannot drive. And we want to serve those customers 10, 20 times a day, moving them from point to point within their community. And there is no better place to do that than retirement communities, and there's no better place to do that than the villages. Retirement community of 125,000 people here in Florida. So to me, it seems like the absolute perfect first place to deploy this technology and the perfect first customer. And over the last 3 years, we've been able to validate that.
Okay.
Riley, can I ask the audience a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
How many of you remember either taking away car keys from a parent or a grandparent? Show of hands. So that is the thought that I wake up with every morning when I think about why we are trying to deploy this technology. I think a lot of people in the industry are sort of fundamentally motivated by the safety case, right? This opportunity to just step change the way we move on roads safely. But for me, I have this image of my grandma when she was 87 and still totally with it, but couldn't drive anymore. And we foundationally changed her life the moment we took away those car keys. And so every day when, at Lyft, our mission is to improve people's lives with the world's best transportation. And those people are very much at the center of this equation for us. And it is that image and those people in those communities where this is potentially game-changing for the way they are able to live as older adults.
I'd love, Jody, to ask you a follow-up about the geographies. And, the interesting part, I think, about deployments today is that they're in these really specific areas. They're not kind of rolled out linearly across the country. There's in these, experiential pockets like Las Vegas. and then in some of these like essential transportation communities, like in the villages. So you have chosen to go into some specific geographies. Talk about why you picked those and what are other places or other types of environments you want to be in the future.
Yeah. So for us, we think about self-driving as part of a multimodal transportation solution. So we want you to be able to get to your kid's soccer game on time, whether that means you're jumping into a self-driving lift or maybe hopping on a lift bike or a scooter. And so for us, this is really about saying, how do we bring self-driving technology to people in a way that doesn't fundamentally sort of change their transportation experience? So you should be able to open up your Lyft app, and the same way you would request a classic Lyft or a Lyft bike, you can now in Las Vegas request a self-driving car powered by Aptiv. I know we've got some Aptiv folks in the audience today. And so the idea here is that for a consumer, you still want to be able to get where you are going on time and know that you have another transportation solution at your fingertips. And so we're able to make a smart decision behind the scenes saying, okay, I know, let's say I'm going to Las Vegas over the weekend for a bachelorette party, and I'm at the Cosmo Hotel, which we serve with Aptiv's self-driving fleet, and I am going over to the Mandalay Bay. If I request a Lyft through my Lyft app, because on our back end we know that that can be served by a self-driving Aptiv, we are able to show that mode to you and give you self-driving as one of your options in our app. But if it's not available, we just don't even give you the option. And so it makes it a very sort of easy, smooth transition for customers as you're dealing with these kind of small rollout pockets that we anticipate seeing for the next few years.
Got it. Okay. And one of the fascinating things about building an AV company in 2019 is there's a lot of other companies in the ecosystem, which I think not a lot of people appreciate. So, there are other startups that are building things that can make your job easier. In some cases, there are manufacturers that have made sort of AV-ready components. Oliver, I'd love to ask you, what are some of the things that you can do in 2019 that you couldn't have done in 2015? Specifically, if you could mention the companies too, I'm fascinated, not because I want to invest in them, but secretly maybe.
So many things. I think, 2015 self-driving car developer would be in disbelief at the things that are available to 2019 self-driving car developer. Whether it is LiDAR that can see 250 meters, whether it's that you can plug into a simulation engine that's as good as Waymo's simulation engine. You can, within days, have a high-resolution 3D map delivered to you that adheres to your spec. The underlying platform of each vehicle, it used to be that you would buy a Ford Fusion or something off a dealership lot, and then you'd spend a few days with some weird connectors into the car, reverse engineering the thing, which is not entirely safe. But now you don't need to do that if you work with vehicle manufacturers. So it just makes the job so much easier, which is why I still retain the optimism that it's not too far away, because it's the little bits and pieces that can, in sum total, take years, are being worked on by hundreds, if not thousands of people that just make our lives infinitely easier, especially ready for commercialization. So yes, there's so much.
What are some of let's ask some harder questions around timelines. What are some of the hardest technical problems that you feel internally in your groups that you still have to get through? Let's start with you, Scott.
Yeah, so I think earlier point, I think one of the biggest challenges is it's hard, but it's pretty straightforward to make a couple of something. In our business, we build hardware, and for my folks and my compatriots to be successful, we have to figure out how to make lots of them, and we have to figure out how to make them automotive grade. And so there's a lot of effort to take something that can be built in labs by PhDs and graduate students and figure out how you make them repeatable, scalable, safe, cost-effective. We track 18 things that a LiDAR system has to do to be successful, and you can't compromise on any of those 18 things. It's everything from eye safety to cost to automotive grade. And to do that all at the same time requires a lot of things to work together. And it takes time. So you go back to your earlier comment of it is taking longer. One of the reasons it's taking longer is this is really hard. And there's a lot of things, a lot of technologies that required some additional time to make sure that they don't work some of the time, but they work all of the time. And you know, that's what we're very much focused on, is delivering platforms that will work all of the time, so that again, that passengers, pedestrians can be safe. So, but you know, you sum that up, automotive grade is a challenge. It's a challenge for us, for our partners. Particularly, you know, I think we have a unique case in that we're also in the optics world, and there's supply chain maturity issues in the optics world that also needs to be addressed. So not only do we have to grow and mature as a company, but we have to work with a lot of our supply chain partners so that they can grow and mature as well.
And you sell, so Luminar sells both to operators, like companies like Voyage, as well as to manufacturers, right?
Yes.
And so my thought about how challenging that must be is that they probably have different needs for your sensor, right? Ultimately, one of them might want to sell it to a customer that expects it's going to work 365 days a year, and an operator might be willing to accept something a little bit different, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I think as our customers are maturing and they're understanding their use case scenarios, and what we're seeing in the market overall now is you know, kind of a divergence in that, again, we have technology companies that are really driving to offer a fully automated experience. The OEMs are tending to now more focus on different levels of autonomy as a feature. So they're progressing in a way that traditionally the automotive industry has, is kind of calculated steps over periods of time to offer features to customers that they can afford and they're willing to pay for. And if you look at those two types of customers, very different needs in terms of the expectations of the LiDAR, price points, life cycle, things of that nature. And so, you know, we're constantly balancing being able to service both of those customers equally.
This is, I think, one of the things about the future of AV deployments in my mind is operators like Voyage, for example, have the ability to go into certain geographies like the villages and operate just there. But on the other hand, if you were, you know, General Motors and traditionally you've been selling companies or cars globally, to sell a self-driving car that only works in 2 cities would seem like a failure, right? And so the operator perspective of AV is, I think, has a fundamental advantage, which will make the next 10 years of development, I think, probably in the favor of some of the operators. So back to the technical sort of difficulties, like what's a gnarly technical issue that you're like, man, and this is something we've got to solve?
For sure. So 2015, Oliver would probably say perception, and it's a broad field, but how do you detect all the important objects in and around you? And it was particularly challenging back then because deep learning as a thing, how you utilize machine learning and computer vision, was still in its formative stages. You also had some constraints on your vision distance, whether it was LiDARs being maxed at 70 meters instead of, again, today, 250, 300 meters. But over the last few years, there's been so many dollars, so many researchers, so many cool innovations that have happened in perception that today that doesn't feel like the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge, actually, to me at least, occurs slightly downstream from perception, which is prediction. So if you want to build an intelligent self-driving car that can maneuver around objects, handle pedestrians at crosswalks, interact intelligently with everything around it, you really do need to be able to predict what they're going to do next. This is something that we as humans, although we may not consider ourselves to be good drivers, we have a few million years of evolution to help inform that we can predict what's going on around us. And cars or self-driving cars today are pretty robotic in that function. So for Voyage, we invest a lot in prediction. How do we intelligently predict what all of these objects around us are going to do in the next 5 seconds? And it's a pretty interesting problem because you have previous data, right? You're able to track objects over time and use those previous patterns to apply it to the future and then try and guess what that thing or guess what many things that object may do. But it's still a very challenging problem set. And it's why that the initial rollout of self-driving cars will be a little, I won't say bumpy, what's a better word? A little, I'll just use bumpy, a little bumpy. because these cars may stop more than a human would. It will be overly cautious when a human may be able to read that person's face and know that they're not going to dart out into the middle of the road. A self-driving car may not have that capability. So it's a very hard problem.
Got it. Thank you. Jody?
I think from my perspective, the hardest technical problem is actually a technical collaboration problem. So, at Lyft, we have a hybrid strategy for self-driving. So we both partner with, the best and brightest self-driving players on the market, like Aptiv and Waymo, but we're also building our own self-driving cars in-house. And one of the challenges we face is, I think everyone who's been sitting in this industry for a few years realizes the amount of, frankly, capital and sweat equity that has to go into solving this problem. And so what we're trying to figure out what we can do in this is sort of solve some of the data problems that sit at the heart of scaling self-driving. So if you think about, building an HD map, not that hard to do once for a segment of road, pretty hard to keep that segment of road up to date, know when there's a road closure or the vice president is coming to town. And then imagine doing that at scale across, the US or the world. And so one of the things that we're really thinking about is how do we sort of use what we do at the center of this ecosystem to say, where are there places where more data would help us help others get to market faster? So whether that looks like, scenario data that we're collecting from our human-powered fleet every day, or HD maps, there's a real opportunity to figure out what are places where we can sort of plug into each other's systems and scale self-driving faster.
Okay. One of the fascinating things I think about Lyft is that, well, people used to always ask me, once self-driving is commoditized, then brands will kind of melt away because you'll just be able to get whatever car is first available to you. And I actually take the opposite view, which is that I believe if you were to get, out from the airport and be able to pick a brand that you really trusted, that was in control of all those systems versus a company you maybe have never heard of before, that you would fundamentally pick the safer brand. And so I think in that regard, Lyft is really interesting because of the sort of positioning of the company. And I'm wondering, how much has Lyft's brand ethos played into how you think about the development of the self-driving part of this?
I mean, very much so. I would say I joined Lyft 4.5 years ago because I wanted to be in a place that put collaboration and communities first. And that is very much the path we've taken with our self-driving deployment. I mean, anytime you're trying to get someone to try a new technology, you're asking them to take a leap of faith with you. And we asked people to do that with us, 6 years ago when we launched Lyft. If I had talked to you guys, half a decade ago and said, pull out your phone, request a ride from some driver you don't know, and trust us, it's going to be safe, you would have looked at me like I was crazy. And so what we really see in bringing this new technology to market is that being able to pull out an app that you use every single day really lowers that barrier for a consumer. They know that Lyft is going to put them first when we're making decisions about what technology to deploy on our platform, and that they feel a little more comfortable, tapping that select self-driving for the very first time.
Yeah, that's one of the, when you think about, and the data shows us that most people only have 2 transportation apps on their main screen. It's usually a navigation app like Google Maps or Waze, and a ride-hailing service like Lyft or Uber. Nowhere in that discussion do you find a car company. So I think it's an incredible challenge that a lot of the way that we interact with transportation today is really mitigated by companies that frankly weren't around 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. How do you build a branded voyage that people will trust if it doesn't have the benefit of being Lyft for the last 6 years? And how did you get the people within the villages to say, although I'm a young guy at the head of a startup, you should trust me with this vehicle?
Right. Yes, this is absolutely critical. I think that the biggest barrier to entry, I think you may have said this, is going to be consumer adoption, right? Do people trust that the thing they're about to get into is safe and will take them from point A to point B? For Voyage specifically, we focus a lot on telling it like it is. So I think there's enough companies out there that will issue press releases and fluff up the language and make it seem like everything's ready to go and hunky-dory. The reality is that this technology is not yet ready to scale across the country, and people don't want to be set the wrong expectations at those sorts of times. So both publicly and privately in discussions with folks like the villages, we just tell them like it is. We say that this technology is not yet at the scale that maybe you read about in the newspapers or whatever, and it has some issues. It adheres to speed limits. Your residents may get a little horn happy by being behind it because it's going to stick to the speed limit. It's going to maybe hit the brakes a little bit when it doesn't need to. And we try and just, again, tell that story publicly and in private to make sure that folks are set the appropriate expectations instead of just saying everything's ready to go.
Great. I'd like to go to some audience questions, but I have to ask a question. How much time do we have left if there's an organizer? Because I don't have a countdown clock in front of me. Do we have 2 minutes or 10 minutes? Does anybody in the back? We have 5 minutes left? Okay.
There we go.
So I'll go to questions in a minute. If you have a question, I think there are people with microphones. One quick question I want to ask the panelists here are, if you could acquire, let's pretend for a second you had unlimited budget, and you could acquire another company in the space, but you can't say like Dunkin' Donuts because you like their latte. It has to be actually in the transportation space. If you can acquire another company, or you can bring on an executive to help your company who isn't currently at your company, who would that be? What company or what individual would that be? Let's start with Scott.
Okay, that's not a lot of time to think about that.
It's a trick question.
Yeah, it is a trick question. So, I think from our perspective, getting our technology in the market requires partnership with a lot of other technology companies. And so, kind of thinking about that question, along the lines of a tier one kind of engagement would make a lot of sense for Lumar. Again, the challenges we face are about the industrialization of the product and then getting the product into the customer's manufacturing platform in a trusted way, and that's really the role of tier ones.
Got it. Great. Okay, Oliver.
I think we're supposed to say each other's companies, right?
I was going to say,
actually, let's carve that out. You can't say somebody else on the platform.
So I think the biggest weakness of Voyage today, similar to your question, is that we are not a known entity and have very little experience in running large-scale operations as a fleet. And if I had to compensate for the weakness, not to use my analogy of saying on the panel, but and this is infinite money, right?
Sure.
And they would accept my offer to buy. Yes, okay. It would be Lyft. Okay. Because I think that.
Congratulations, Jody. You can buy another house.
And the reason I would say that is because I do believe it's very important that they currently do run multiple different fleets of different vehicles and understand how to do that at the scale that is frankly, astronomical to us right now. And then secondly, I'd acquire a LiDAR company like Lumina.
Got it. Okay. So Voyage is going to acquire Lyft.
Exactly.
All right, Jody.
And this is how I end up, breaking the financial markets accidentally.
Yeah, Jody's a public company, so.
The types of acquisitions you actually do see us and will see us making are very much in that world that I was talking about, which is where can we find places where we can bring technology players on who allow us to help use what we know to bring data back to the self-driving market. So for instance, we acquired a company called Blue Vision Labs that does HD mapping with cell phones. Mm-hmm. Still early phases of that acquisition, but I think you should continue to expect us to play in the space of how can Lyft continue to be a good partner to other players in the self-driving ecosystem. And then I'll just cheat and say Oliver as my CEO. I'm not bringing him into, you can come join the self-driving division. I'm not replacing the Lyft CEO anytime soon. Okay. But he's my CEO of choice.
We've made some news here. All right. I was going to go to audience questions, but they're telling me time is up. So as a replacement for that, you can come and accost these individuals at lunchtime, which I think is the next thing up. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Riley.
Ladies and gentlemen, next up is lunch, sponsored by Cisco. Join Michelle Maggiore and Nett Cabot for a fantastic lunch and learn. Breakout sessions begin right after lunch with a general session back here at 3:45. Have a great lunch.
Sitting in the morning sun, I'll be sitting when the evening comes, watching the ships roll in, and then I'll watch them roll away again. Yeah, I'm sitting on the dock of the bay, watching the tide roll away. Ooh, I'm just sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time. I left my home